Some stories are not meant to fade. Some names refuse to disappear. And some nights leave questions so heavy that time itself cannot erase them. Welcome to Hidden Truth, the channel where silence is questioned and forgotten voices are brought back into the light. If you believe the truth matters, if you believe unresolved stories deserve to be told, then subscribe to Hidden Truth now and become part of a community that refuses to look away. On the night of July 11th, 1990, a young woman stepped off a train in Melbourne after an ordinary evening with friends. She was just minutes away from home. Her car was waiting in a quiet station car park. Her family expected her soon, but she never arrived. Her name was Sarah MacDiarmid. She was 23 years old. She had crossed oceans to build a new life. She had routines, plans, and people who loved her. And in one unexplained moment, she vanished. Blood was later found beside her car. Witnesses heard a woman scream for her keys. Drag marks led into darkness, yet no body was ever found. Police believe Sarah was murdered. Her family believes someone knows the truth. And after more than 3 decades, the mystery of what happened at Kananook railway station still haunts Australia. Tonight, we will follow Sarah's journey from her childhood in Scotland to her final known steps on a winter night in Melbourne. We will examine what is known, what was missed, and what still remains unanswered. Stay with Hidden Truth, because this is not just a story. This is a real-life mystery that demands answers. Sarah MacDiarmid was born on November 15, 1966 in Scotland, a country shaped by quiet villages, long winters, and close family bonds. And she spent her early years growing up in the Scottish Highlands, where life moved slowly and people knew one another by name. And those who knew Sarah later described her as calm, thoughtful, and dependable, a young woman who listened more than she spoke and carried a quiet strength that came from knowing who she was. And as she grew older, Sarah developed a strong sense of responsibility, always showing up on time, always keeping her promises, always making sure her family knew where she was, and this reliability became a defining part of her character, one that would later make her disappearance even more disturbing, because nothing about Sarah suggested recklessness or secrecy. And in 1987, when Sarah was in her early 20s, her family made a major decision that would change the course of all their lives, choosing to leave Scotland and emigrate to Australia, seeking new opportunities, warmer weather, and a future that felt more open than the one they were leaving behind. And for Sarah, this move was both exciting and challenging, because it meant starting again in a country far from everything familiar. But she embraced the change with determination, finding work, building friendships, and learning how to navigate a new culture without losing her sense of self. And by 1990, Sarah had settled into a stable routine in Melbourne, a city that offered both opportunity and anonymity. And she worked during the day, socialized in the evenings, and stayed connected to her family, often letting them know her plans and expected return times, because that was simply who she was. And one of the activities Sarah enjoyed most was playing tennis, a sport that allowed her to unwind after work and spend time with friends in a relaxed and familiar setting. And on July 11, 1990, Sarah followed what had become a normal pattern for her life, finishing work and then meeting 2 friends to play tennis at Flinders Park in Batman Avenue, East Melbourne, a location that was known at the time for casual sports and evening recreation. And nothing about that night stood out as unusual or dangerous, because it was winter, the air was cold, and the city moved on in its usual rhythm. And after their game ended, the 3 women walked together toward Richmond railway station, talking and laughing as they went. And when they arrived, they realized they had just missed their intended Frankston Line train, a small inconvenience that most people would forget within minutes. But instead of waiting, they decided to board another train that would take them to Caulfield, where they could change services and still make their way home. And this decision, simple and reasonable at the time, would later become one of the most examined details of the case, because it altered the timing of Sarah's arrival and placed her alone at a quiet station late at night. And after reaching Caulfield, the group transferred to a Frankston service, continuing their journey south along Melbourne's coastline, and the train moved through the darkness, stopping at stations that grew quieter with each passing minute. And when the train reached Bond Beach station, Sarah's 2 friends stepped off, saying their goodbyes, while Sarah remained on board because her car was parked 1 stop further at Kananook railway station. And this was the last time Sarah was seen by anyone who knew her personally. And at approximately 10:20 in the evening, Sarah stepped off the train at Kananook, and witnesses later reported seeing a woman matching her description crossing the footbridge toward the station car park, and the car park itself was poorly lit, with shadows stretching across the ground and very few people around. And Sarah had parked her red 1978 Honda Civic there earlier that day, expecting to return safely as she always had. And at this moment, Sarah was doing nothing unusual, nothing risky, nothing that would suggest she was about to vanish. And yet something happened in the minutes that followed, something that interrupted her routine and changed her fate. Because by 11 o'clock, Sarah had not arrived home, and her family began to worry, not because they were overly anxious, but because this behavior did not match who Sarah was. And as the minutes turned into hours, concern turned into fear. And at 1 o'clock in the morning, Sarah's brother Sarah MacDiarmid made a decision that no family member ever wants to make, driving to Kananook railway station to meet the last train at 1:15 in the morning, hoping against hope that his sister would step off and explain the delay, but she did not. And instead, Sarah found Sarah's car still sitting in the car park, its doors locked, its boot locked, and no sign of Sarah anywhere. And in that moment, the ordinary life Sarah had carefully built across 2 countries came to a sudden and terrifying halt, leaving behind only questions that would grow heavier with time. The night of July 11th, 1990 was cold and ordinary across Melbourne, and nothing about the evening suggested that it would become one of the most disturbing nights in the city's history. Because after Sarah MacDiarmid stepped off the train at Kananook railway station at approximately 10:20 in the evening, she was simply following a familiar path she had walked many times before, crossing the footbridge and heading toward the station car park, where a red 1978 Honda Civic waited. And the car park itself was poorly lit, surrounded by bushes and shadows, with only the sound of distant trains and occasional traffic breaking the silence. And in those first few minutes after her arrival, Sarah was still part of the normal world, a young woman walking toward her car after work and tennis, unaware that she was about to vanish. And investigators later believed that whatever happened to Sarah occurred very quickly, within a narrow window of time when the station was quiet and visibility was low, because there was no evidence of a prolonged struggle near the train platform, only signs that something violent took place near the car itself. And when police were later called to the scene, they discovered bloodstains on the ground beside Sarah's vehicle, a finding that immediately changed the case from a missing person inquiry into a suspected crime. And nearby, investigators also found drag marks leading away from the car and into the bushes that bordered the station car park, suggesting that Sarah may have been forced away against her will. And one of the most haunting pieces of evidence was a cigarette lighter belonging to Sarah, lying on the ground as if dropped during a moment of panic. And as the investigation unfolded, witnesses began to come forward with accounts that added a chilling human voice to the physical evidence. Because several people reported hearing a woman shouting the words, "Give me back my keys," a sentence that would echo through the case for decades. And these cries were believed to have occurred around the same time Sarah arrived at the station, strengthening the theory that she was confronted almost immediately after leaving the train. And the idea that Sarah may have been attacked for her car keys introduced a terrifying possibility that her disappearance may have been the result of a sudden and opportunistic act rather than a planned crime. And yet, despite the violence suggested by the evidence, Sarah's car was never stolen, because it remained locked and untouched in the car park, raising further questions about the motive behind the attack. And within hours of Sarah being reported missing, police launched a large-scale search operation, treating the case with urgency due to the clear signs of foul play. And for 21 days, more than 250 police officers searched the surrounding area by air, land, and sea, covering bushland, coastal areas, waterways, and nearby suburbs. And helicopters scanned from above, while ground teams combed through dense vegetation, hoping to find any trace of Sarah or evidence that could explain what happened. But despite the size and intensity of the search, nothing was found. No clothing, no personal belongings beyond what was already at the station, and no sign of Sarah herself. And as days turned into weeks, the reality of the situation became harder to ignore, because the absence of evidence began to suggest that whoever took Sarah knew how to make someone disappear, or that her body had been moved far from the station before the search even began. And police faced growing pressure from the public and Sarah's family to find answers, but leads were scarce, and without witnesses who could identify a suspect, the investigation stalled. And yet the case never truly went cold, because the disturbing nature of the evidence kept it alive in the minds of investigators. And years later, in May 2006, a coronial inquest led by Ian West officially concluded that Sarah MacDiarmid had met her death as a result of foul play, even though the exact circumstances and location of her death could not be determined. And this finding confirmed what her family had feared from the beginning, that Sarah had not simply walked away from her life, but had been the victim of a violent crime. And in response to the lack of answers, authorities increased the reward for information, starting with $50,000, later boosted by additional funding, and eventually reaching $1 million, a clear signal that police believed someone out there held the key to solving the case. And over the years, investigators explored possible links to known violent offenders, including convicted serial killers whose crimes occurred in the same era, because patterns of violence along Melbourne's transport corridors raised troubling questions. And in 2011, police interviewed Paul Denier, a convicted serial killer responsible for murders in Melbourne during the early 1990s. But Denier denied any involvement in Sarah's disappearance and later expressed anger at being repeatedly associated with the case. And police publicly stated that there was no evidence linking him to Sarah. And in 2014, media reports suggested that another convicted offender, Bandali Debs, had been considered by investigators as part of routine efforts to examine connections between unsolved cases and known criminals. But police declined to comment in detail, stating only that the investigation remained active. And through all these years, one fact never changed. Sarah MacDiarmid was never found, and the space she left behind at Kananook railway station remained a silent reminder of how quickly an ordinary night can turn into a lifelong mystery, leaving behind blood on concrete, unanswered screams, and a family forced to live with questions that time has never answered. As the hours passed after Sarah MacDiarmid failed to return home on the night of July 11, 1990, the situation moved quickly from concern to crisis, because once police confirmed that Sarah's car remained untouched in the Kananook railway station car park and blood had been found beside it, the case was no longer treated as a simple delay or misunderstanding, but as a suspected violent crime that demanded immediate action, and officers began securing the area, marking evidence locations and interviewing anyone who might have been near the station that night, while Sarah's family waited nearby in a state of disbelief, struggling to understand how a normal evening could end in such silence. And within hours, a large-scale search operation was launched, drawing resources from across the region, because investigators believed that if Sarah were to be found, the first day would be critical. And police combed through the station grounds, nearby streets, and surrounding bushland, moving carefully through darkness and cold, hoping to find any sign of her. And as dawn arrived, the search expanded even further, with teams spreading out across the Mornington Peninsula, checking coastal areas, drains, construction sites, and any location where a body or evidence could be concealed. And helicopters scanned from above while ground units moved through thick vegetation, calling out Sarah's name into the silence. And for 21 days, more than 250 police officers remained involved in this operation, an extraordinary commitment that reflected the seriousness of the case and the clear signs of foul play. And yet, despite the size of the effort, the search produced nothing. No clothing, no personal belongings, no witnesses who could provide a clear description of a suspect, and no trace of Sarah herself. And this absence of evidence became one of the most troubling aspects of the case, because it suggested that whoever was responsible either acted quickly and decisively or had knowledge of the area that allowed them to move unnoticed. And investigators were left to reconstruct the crime using only fragments: the blood beside the car, the drag marks into the bushes, and the haunting reports of a woman screaming for her keys. And these details painted a picture of a sudden confrontation, one that likely occurred within minutes of Sarah leaving the train, before she had any chance to reach safety or call for help. And police explored the possibility that the attack may have been opportunistic, perhaps involving someone waiting near the station. But the lack of stolen property complicated this theory, because Sarah's car remained locked and untouched, raising the possibility that the motive was not theft, but something far more sinister. And as days passed with no breakthroughs, investigators widened their focus, examining known offenders in the region, reviewing unsolved crimes with similar features, and considering whether Sarah's disappearance could be connected to a broader pattern of violence occurring in Melbourne during that period. And the early 1990s were marked by public fear surrounding attacks on women, particularly near public transport. And this context added urgency and pressure to the investigation, because the idea that a predator might be operating freely was deeply unsettling. And police also reviewed Sarah's personal life in detail, looking for any sign of conflict, secret relationships, or threats. But nothing emerged to suggest that she had enemies or was involved in risky situations. And everyone who knew Sarah described her as cautious and predictable, someone who followed routines and avoided unnecessary danger, which only deepened the mystery of how she could disappear so completely. And as weeks turned into months, the case shifted from an active search to a prolonged investigation. And while police continued to receive tips, none led to a breakthrough, and the lack of progress weighed heavily on Sarah's family, who were forced to live with uncertainty rather than closure. And each day without answers became another reminder that time was working against them, because memories fade, witnesses move away, and evidence degrades. And yet, despite these challenges, Authorities refused to close the case, maintaining that Sarah's disappearance was the result of foul play and that the truth could still be uncovered, and this determination was reflected years later when a coronial inquest was held in May 2006, where coroner Ian West reviewed the evidence and concluded that Sarah MacDiarmid had died as a result of a criminal act, even though the precise circumstances could not be established, and this official finding validated what her family had believed from the beginning, that Sarah did not choose to disappear, and that her absence was the result of violence rather than chance. And following this conclusion, efforts to generate new leads intensified, with authorities increasing the reward for information in the hope that someone who had remained silent might finally come forward. And while the passage of time made the case more difficult, it also created the possibility that loyalties could change, guilt could surface, or memories could be re-examined. And through it all, one question remained unanswered. How could a young woman vanish from a public place, leave behind clear signs of a struggle, and yet never be found? And this question would continue to haunt investigators, the public, and Sarah's family, turning the search for her into a long and painful wait for truth that refused to arrive. As the investigation into the disappearance of Sarah MacDiarmid moved forward without clear answers, police were forced to confront a difficult reality: that the evidence left behind at Kananook railway station pointed to violence but did not point to a single person, and this absence of a suspect created a space filled with speculation, fear, and unanswered questions. Because when a crime happens in a public place with no arrest, the unknown becomes more frightening than any confirmed truth, and investigators began reviewing the broader context of Melbourne in the early 1990s, a time when public concern about attacks on women near transport hubs was growing. And this environment led police to examine whether Sarah's disappearance could be linked to other crimes occurring around the same period, especially those involving isolated locations, late hours, and sudden violence. And as part of this process, police reviewed known violent offenders who were active or later identified in the region, not because there was direct evidence tying them to Sarah, but because history has shown that patterns sometimes emerge only when cases are viewed together. And one name that repeatedly surfaced in public discussion was Paul Denier, a convicted serial killer responsible for multiple murders in Melbourne during the early 1990s. And although the timing and geography of Denier's crimes caused public suspicion, investigators approached the possibility carefully, because linking cases without evidence can mislead an investigation. And in 2011, police formally interviewed Denier about Sarah MacDiarmid, giving him the opportunity to address the allegations directly, and Denier denied any involvement in her disappearance, expressing anger and frustration at being repeatedly accused of crimes he claimed he did not commit. And after reviewing the available information, police stated publicly that there was no evidence connecting Denier to Sarah's case, a statement that disappointed some, but reinforced the need to rely on facts rather than fear. And as years passed, attention shifted to other possibilities, including the idea that Sarah's disappearance could have been the result of a one-time offender rather than a known serial criminal, someone who acted impulsively and then faded back into ordinary life. And this theory was particularly troubling because it suggested that the person responsible could have blended back into the community unnoticed, carrying the secret for decades. And in 2014, media reports indicated that investigators had also considered Bandali Debs, a convicted offender, as part of routine efforts to examine links between unsolved cases and known criminals. But police declined to comment in detail, stating only that the investigation remained active, and this refusal to elaborate reflected a common reality in long-running cases: that authorities must balance transparency with the risk of compromising potential leads. And while suspects were examined and ruled in or out, one of the most painful aspects of the case remained the silence, because despite widespread media coverage, public appeals, and a reward that eventually reached $1 million, no decisive information emerged. And this silence raised difficult questions about whether witnesses had failed to come forward out of fear, loyalty, or uncertainty, or whether crucial details had been overlooked in the confusion of the early investigation. And police also faced the challenge of time, because as years pass, memories fade, people move away, and physical evidence becomes harder to interpret. And yet time can also work in unexpected ways, because relationships change, consciences shift, and secrets that once felt safe can become unbearable. And for this reason, authorities continued to encourage anyone with information to speak, emphasizing that even small details could make a difference. And throughout this period, Sarah's family remained central to the public memory of the case, participating in anniversaries, speaking to the media, and refusing to let her name disappear, and their persistence kept pressure on investigators and reminded the public that behind every unsolved case is a human story, not just a file number. And while theories continued to circulate, from opportunistic car theft gone wrong to targeted violence by an unknown attacker, none could be proven. And the lack of a body further complicated matters, because without it, establishing the precise sequence of events became nearly impossible, and this uncertainty allowed multiple narratives to coexist, each plausible yet unconfirmed. And as the case moved deeper into the realm of cold investigations, it became clear that solving it would require something new, a forgotten memory, a delayed confession, or a piece of information that had never been shared. And until that moment arrived, the disappearance of Sarah MacDiarmid remained suspended in a space between knowledge and speculation, where suspects were examined, silence endured, and shadows continued to obscure the truth. As the years passed after the disappearance of Sarah MacDiarmid, the investigation continued to exist alongside a quieter and more painful reality, the daily life of a family forced to live without answers. Because while police files could be reopened and theories revisited, Sarah's parents, siblings, and friends had to wake up every morning with the same unanswered question of where she was and what had happened to her. And from the very beginning, her family rejected the idea that Sarah had chosen to disappear, because everything about her character, her habits, and her relationships pointed to a young woman who valued connection and routine. And this belief became the foundation of their determination to keep her case alive in the public eye. And on anniversaries of her disappearance, they returned to Kananook railway station, the last place Sarah was seen, standing in the same car park where her car had been found, laying flowers and wreaths beneath a memorial that marked the spot where her life had been violently interrupted. And these gatherings were not only acts of remembrance, but also quiet protests against forgetting, because each year that passed without answers felt like a reminder of how easily time can move on while grief remains frozen. And in 2010, marking 20 years since Sarah vanished, her family made a decision to turn their pain into purpose by creating a website called Not Alone, a space designed to support other families dealing with missing loved ones and unresolved cases. And through this platform, they shared their story openly, hoping that visibility might bring new information or encourage others to speak up. And the creation of this website also reflected a deeper truth about long-term missing person cases, that families often become advocates, investigators, and voices for justice when official progress slows. And throughout these years, Sarah's family worked closely with police, responding to calls for information, participating in media interviews, and supporting renewed appeals whenever the case resurfaced in the public conversation. And one such moment came when police used major anniversaries of Sarah's disappearance to issue fresh requests for information, emphasizing that cold cases are not closed cases, and that history has shown that even decades-old investigations can be solved when the right detail comes forward. And this message was echoed by senior officers who reminded the public that silence protects perpetrators, and that even information that seems small or insignificant can become critical when combined with other evidence. And despite these efforts, the absence of closure continued to shape the family's lives. Because without a body, there could be no funeral, no final goodbye, and no clear moment when grief could begin to heal. And instead, they lived with a constant sense of waiting, a feeling that Sarah could still be found, that the truth could still emerge, and that justice could still be served. And this emotional limbo is one of the most cruel aspects of unresolved disappearances, because it denies families the certainty that allows mourning to take a defined shape. And as years turned into decades, new generations learned Sarah's name not as a living person, but as a mystery, a photograph, and a story passed down through media reports and public appeals. And yet for her family, Sarah never became a symbol or a headline. She remained a sister, a daughter, and a presence missing from everyday moments. And during this time, public interest in true crime stories began to grow. And with it came renewed attention to long unsolved cases like Sarah's. And in 2021, this renewed interest led to the release of a 9-part Australian crime podcast titled Searching for Sarah MacDiarmid, written and hosted by author Vicky Petratus, which examined not only the facts of the case but also the human impact of Sarah's disappearance. And the podcast introduced her story to a new audience, many of whom were not even born when she vanished. And this renewed attention demonstrated the power of storytelling in keeping cases alive, because each retelling creates another opportunity for recognition, memory, and possibly truth. And through all these years of media attention, memorials, and public appeals, one reality never changed. Sarah MacDiarmid never came home, and her family never stopped waiting, holding on to the hope that somewhere, someone would finally speak, break the silence, and allow the truth to surface, not only for Sarah, but for everyone who had spent decades living in the shadow of her disappearance. More than 3 decades have passed since Sarah MacDiarmid stepped off a train at Kananook railway station and disappeared into the darkness. Yet her case remains painfully open, suspended between what is known and what has never been explained, and while investigators confirmed, through a coronial finding in May 2006, that Sarah died as a result of a criminal act, the absence of her body and the absence of a confession have left the full truth hidden, locked away with someone who has chosen silence over accountability. And this silence has echoed through the years, affecting not only Sarah's family but also a wider community that has been forced to confront the reality that a young woman can vanish from a public place and never be found. And despite extensive police searches, repeated public appeals, and a reward that grew to $1 million, no single piece of information has been strong enough to bring closure. And yet history has shown that cases like this are not beyond resolution, because time can loosen secrets, change loyalties, and weaken the walls people build around guilt. And the continued attention given to Sarah's story through media investigations, memorials, and long-form journalism has ensured that her name has not been forgotten, and that whoever is responsible cannot fully escape the weight of what they did. And Sarah's family has carried this burden with extraordinary strength, transforming grief into advocacy and pain into persistence, refusing to allow her disappearance to fade into obscurity. And their message has remained consistent across decades, that someone knows something and that the truth is still reachable if the right person speaks. And Sarah's story is not just about a crime, but about responsibility, memory, and the cost of unanswered violence. Because unresolved cases do not end when investigations slow, they continue in the lives of those left behind, shaping birthdays, anniversaries, and everyday moments with absence. And the reason stories like Sarah's must continue to be told is not for entertainment, but for justice. Because attention keeps pressure alive, and pressure keeps truth within reach. And this documentary is based on documented and verified sources, including Wikipedia records on the disappearance of Sarah MacDiarmid, reporting from The Age, the Sydney Morning Herald, Australian Broadcasting Corporation, News Corporation Australia, coronial inquest findings led by Ian West, official statements from Victoria Police, archived case records from the DOE network, and long-form investigative journalism, including the Searching for Sarah MacDiarmid podcast written and hosted by Vicky Petraitis. And these sources confirm that Sarah MacDiarmid was real, her disappearance was real, and the questions surrounding her fate are still unanswered. And if you believe that stories like this deserve to be remembered, if you believe silence should never be stronger than truth, and if you want to support a channel that gives voice to the forgotten, then subscribe to Hidden Truth, because every subscriber helps keep these stories alive, every view keeps pressure on the unanswered, and together we make sure the truth never stops searching for the light on Hidden Truth.